Some women don't chase, and yet they're never forgotten. They move through the world like shadows cast by moonlight, present, felt, but never grasped. What separates these women from those who exhaust themselves in pursuit of validation isn't strategy or manipulation. It's something far deeper. It's the ability to recognize when someone is asking her to abandon herself. In the theater of human connection, there exists an ancient dance between the conscious and unconscious mind. Carl Jung understood this intimately: how we project our unlived selves onto others, how we seek in another what we refuse to cultivate within ourselves. The woman who has begun her individuation journey, who has faced her shadow and integrated her contradictions, becomes a mirror that reflects back the fragmented psyche of those still trapped in their ego's demands. She notices something others miss. When someone approaches her with certain requests, she hears not just the words, but the desperate whisper of their unconscious, the parts of themselves they've abandoned, now seeking completion through her surrender. Watch her when he asks her to carry the weight of his emotional world. Not to share it, but to carry it entirely. His anima, that feminine aspect of his psyche, has been neglected, rejected, pushed into the shadows until it withered. Now he seeks a flesh and blood woman to perform the emotional intelligence he refuses to develop within himself. Fix my relationship with my mother, the request whispers beneath casual conversation. Heal my wounds without me having to face them. Be my therapist, my mother, my emotional container, but never ask me to grow. The unconscious woman accepts this projection, believing that love means becoming smaller so he can remain unchanged. But the individuated woman recognizes this as a request to abandon her own emotional landscape, to become a foreign country where his unprocessed pain can hide. She feels the gravitational pull of his need, the way it tugs at her own shadow. Bite that damn her own unlived savior complex, her own wounds around being needed. But she has learned to distinguish between love and symbiosis, between connection and consumption. There's a particular violin in being asked to lose yourself gradually, like water evaporating under desert sun. He doesn't demand it outright. That would be too obvious, too easy to reject. Instead, it comes wrapped in romance. You're so different from other women. You don't need those friendships anymore. You don't need those dreams. We have each other. The animus within her, that masculine principle of direction and purpose, begins to whisper warnings, but his projections are sophisticated. He has unconsciously identified her strength and seeks to absorb it rather than develop his own. Every aspect of her individuality becomes a threat to his fragmented sense of self. Jung wrote of the shadow's tendency to project itself onto others, and here she witnesses it in real time. His unlived potential, his abandoned dreams, his rejected authenticity, all of it seeking refuge in her identity. The request is simple: become no one so he can remain everyone in his own mind. The woman walking the path of individuation recognizes this as spiritual death disguised as devotion. She has fought too hard to integrate her various selves, the mother, the lover, the warrior, the shaky, to allow them to be dissolved for someone else's comfort. Here lies perhaps the most insidious request: to become complicit in his shadow work avoidance. Don't mention what you saw, spoken in 100 different ways. Don't question my contradictions. Don't hold me accountable for my words versus my actions. Look away when I embody everything I claim to despise. This is the request to become morally blind, to sacrifice her inner witness, that sacred observer within who notes truth from falsehood, integrity from performance. He asks her to join him in the comfortable darkness of unconsciousness, where growth is unnecessary and responsibility is optional. The woman who has done her shadow work recognizes this immediately. She has spent countless nights in the underworld of her own psyche, facing her own hypocrisies, owning her own projections. She will not abandon this hard-won consciousness to enable someone else's spiritual slumber. His ego fears her clarity because it illuminates his self-deception. Rather than use her perception as a mirror for his own growth, he seeks to dim her light so his shadows can dance undisturbed. There comes a moment, quiet, unremarkable to outside observers, when something shifts within her. It's not dramatic. There's no confrontation, no grand speech. Instead, she simply stops explaining, stops adjusting, stops contorting herself to fit the shape of his needs. The Stoics understood this principle. We cannot control others' actions, only our response to them. But trauma psychology adds another layer. Sometimes our responses aren't truly our own, but echoes of ancient wounds, unconscious patterns passed down through generations of women who learned to disappear. She recognizes her own shadow in this moment, the part of her that believes her worth is measured by her usefulness to others, the wounded girl who learned that love requires self-abandonment. This recognition doesn't bring shame, it brings liberation. Energy moves like water, seeking its own level. The individuated woman learns to recognize when someone approaches her not for connection, but for consumption. They ask not for her presence, but for her life force, not for her thoughts, but for her vitality to fill their inner void. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious reveals itself here. These are not personal requests, but archetypal ones, patterns that repeat across cultures and centuries. The empty vessel seeking to be filled, the hungry ghost demanding endless feeding, the wounded king requiring the lifeblood of the feminine to maintain his illusion of wholeness. She observes how exhausted she feels after certain conversations, how depleted certain relationships leave her. This isn't love. This is spiritual parasitism, disguised as need, wrapped in urgency, presented as flattery. You're so strong, they say, meaning, be strong so I don't have to be. The woman walking the path of individuation understands that true strength sometimes means protecting one's energy like a sacred flame, allowing it to illuminate rather than be consumed. The final request is the most sophisticated. Sacrifice your present self for a version of me that may never exist. This is the future faking that trauma psychology identifies as a manipulation tactic, but Jung would recognize as the ego's attempt to avoid present moment accountability. When I'm ready, he promises, when I've healed, when I've changed, then I'll be the man you deserve. Meanwhile, she's asked to invest her precious present moments in a fantasy, to love a projection while the real person before her remains uncommitted to growth. The individuated woman recognizes this as asking her to abandon her own process of becoming for his timeline of maybe. She has learned that individuation happens in the eternal now, not in the conditional future. She will not hold her breath while he holds her future hostage. This recognition doesn't make her bitter. It makes her sovereign. Like Inanna returning from the underworld, she carries the wisdom of her descent. She has seen how the unconscious operates, how projections masquerade as love, how ego needs disguise themselves as relationship requirements. Her boundaries become not walls but membranes, permeable to authentic connection, impermeable to unconscious demands. She begins to attract different energy entirely, not because she's changed her external behavior, but because she's transformed her internal relationship to herself. The shadow work she has done becomes her protection. She recognizes manipulative requests not because she's cynical, but because she's conscious. She's intimate with her own darkness, which makes her immune to others' unconscious projections. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we suffer more in imagination than reality. The woman who has integrated these lessons stops suffering for potential futures that require her diminishment. She stops carrying the weight of others' unlived lives. She stops trying to love someone into consciousness, understanding that growth is an inside job. This isn't coldness, it's clarity. This isn't abandonment, it's boundaries. This isn't rejection. It's recognition that true love requires two whole people, not one person carrying the shadows of two. She becomes like water, fluid, adaptable, but never losing her essential nature. She can be gentle without being weak, compassionate without being codependent, loving without losing herself. The woman who walks away from these 5 requests doesn't do so in anger or resentment. She walks away in the same spirit she approaches all things, with consciousness, with intention, with respect for the sacred work of becoming fully herself. She understands that saying no to unconscious demands is saying yes to conscious love, that protecting her energy is protecting her ability to truly show up, that refusing to carry someone else's shadow is freeing both of them to do their own work. Her absence becomes more powerful than her presence ever was when she was diminished. Those who sought to use her energy find themselves facing their own emptiness. Those who projected their unlived selves onto her must finally meet those abandoned parts within themselves. She doesn't look back, not because she doesn't care, but because she has learned the difference between compassion and complicity. She loves from wholeness now, not from wounds. She gives from overflow, not from obligation. The woman who walks away in silence isn't weak. She simply sees more. She sees the difference between connection and consumption, between love and projection, between growth and stagnation. She sees that sometimes the most loving thing she can do is refuse to enable someone's unconsciousness. She becomes unforgettable not because she chased, but because she chose herself. Not because she was needed, but because she was whole. Not because she filled someone else's void, but because she honored her own fullness. In the end, the woman who says no to these 5 requests says yes to something far more powerful: herself, conscious, integrated, and free. What requests have you been saying yes to that ask you to abandon yourself? Share your journey of recognition in the comments below, and remember, consciousness is the most beautiful gift you can give both to yourself and to the world.